Hey friends, before we dive into today's episode, I wanted to tell you about our collective's newest partner. Meet Contact Monkey. Employee engagement is at the forefront of organizational strategy now more than ever. Internal comms needs to step up and be the backbone of company culture as organizations adapt to a new way of work. Contact Monkey is the ideal solution to streamline your internal communications all from within your Outlook or Gmail inbox. With Contact Monkey, you can create beautiful email newsletters using a wide range of customizable email templates. Drive employee engagement by including pulse surveys, employee net promoter score, and anonymous comments to enable a two-way conversation with your employees. And send employee emails directly from your inbox to existing distribution list. Contact Monkey does all the hard work, so you can sit back and watch your employee insights pour into your Contact Monkey dashboard in real time. To try Contact Monkey's free demo, visit www.contactmonkey.com/ICPro. I'm Sarah Jackson. Welcome to Internal Comms Pro, the podcast. This season, we're closing the gap. I've tracked down the experts that can help us as internal communicators close the gap from where we are now to where we need to be. We're connecting the dots to drive value and lead from the inside out.
If I have someone at the leadership table, I want them to add value. How do you show up at the leadership table? How are you demonstrating value?
Today's episode takes us to Alberta, Canada, to internal comms expert Calvin Seaman, who is leading his team to disrupting internal comms in the banking industry, typically an environment that is resistant to change and innovation. Such disruption resulted in Calvin's department winning Department of the Year at this year's IABC World Conference. Today, Calvin connects the dots for us to learn the optimal IC department structure and gives us the key questions we should be asking, questions that help us show up at the leadership table in a way that empowers us to drive value. This and much more on today's show.
My name is Calvin Seaman. I am the Managing Director of Internal Communications at ATB Financial.
So tell me a little bit about ATB Financial for our listeners. Where are you located? How big? How many employees do you have? Paint a picture of ATB for me.
All right, we are located in Alberta, Canada, and only in Alberta. And we are a financial institution, a full-service financial institution, and we're actually owned by the government. 82 years ago, we were created by the government as a crown corporation, and we've been owned by them ever since. But we operate very independent. We have over 700,000 customers, 5,500 employees, and only operate within the boundaries of Alberta, Canada. Yeah, and I've been here for 11 years, just over 11 and a half years, but it has grown substantially customer base wise and definitely reputationally throughout the province, and a very progressive company. Based on the fact that it's owned by the government, you might think the opposite. Government bureaucracy can often slow things down, but as a whole, whether it's products or whether it's our corporate culture and how we work, it's a very progressive company. It's been a great place to work for 11 years. And just this year, we were named the best place to work in Canada.
You have 5,500 employees. Tell me specifically about your internal comms department. How is it structured, and how many people kind of are on your team?
Sure. For the last 2 years, we've had a bit of a different structure. So I'm going to give you just a brief background on what that was like before our current structure. So over the years, internal communications had lived in marketing. It had lived in various teams, but never as one. And so if an area of the business like retail financial services or investment services, if they saw a need for internal communications and they had the budget, they hired people. And we operated very embedded, very siloed within the organization. And then around 2 years ago, we made a bold move to move everyone together into one internal communications team. And so how many people we had in each department, again, depended on the desire from that group, their budget, how much they wanted to invest in it. And so we had teams of various sizes throughout. And what we wanted to do when we came back together was, or when we came together, not back together, came together for the first time, was have an ability to focus people on the right work, maintain relationships in the business, make sure the right level of work was working on the right, or the right level of role was working on the right level of work. And so we took some time to look at what that might be. So we have a mix of centralized and decentralized, I would say. We have directors and senior managers that are embedded in the business and own the relationship. And then we have a communication center that would support the work where you could ebb and flow it better and focus on the right thing. And we have a team of 21 right now. We have a very large internal communications team.
That is a large team. I mean, I know we've done a lot of interviews here on the show, and even some of our extremely large organizations do not have that size of team. So I'm curious about that. Is that because of the old way and it was decentralized, and then when you put everybody together now it's 21, or is it as a whole leadership values internal comms, so that's why we pour so many people into it? Like, how, if I'm sitting here listening to this as a listener, I'm thinking, how do I get 21 people on my team?
Yeah, it's a mix of all those things you're touching on. I would say a couple of things. What I hear from other organizations, they're very focused on what their internal comms would be. It might be just executive communications. It might be just the strategy culture pieces. I would say probably in those organizations, there's other people doing communications that aren't part of that communications team, whether that's operational communications or HR communications. Like we do it all for sure. Anything that you would probably put into that bailiwick of internal communications, our team is doing. So I would look for those resources out there that might be doing communications that aren't part of the team. Trickier, right? When it's 25% of someone's role and there's 10 of those roles out there, but it for sure was a mix of the organization valuing it, seeing the value it adds, so investing in those roles when it was decentralized, and then their willingness even to allow us to come together as one team and the power behind that. When you've had control over who's supporting you and what they're focused on, it said something when the organization was willing to move them together and still support the organization as a whole.
So let's get into a little bit more into the weeds on this structure. You're an award-winning team, and so I want to talk about the award, but I want to talk about, before we get into kind of how you won the award, what you won the award for. I think you've won consecutive awards. That's kind of the manifestation, I think, of the thought and structure that you're talking about. If I'm leading a team, what is the optimal structure? I mean, when you're leading that team of 21, so if I get this straight, you have a centralized team, but yet it's structured in a way where people are focused on each part of the business, but they still have a strong connection to your overall strategy. So dive a little bit more into that structure of what makes it an optimal structure.
Yeah, I would say one thing we did as a team early on when you were coming together was to get together and kind of create that vision of what does success look like in 5 years from now, and what are those barriers from us getting there. You kind of had all roles doing all the work, right? If you were a director, you were creating a strategy for your team and you were writing the article and you were posting it. You did soup to nuts on everything. If you were a manager, same kind of thing. You were writing the strategy, you were executing the tactics, you were posting them, you were measuring, you were doing everything. And depending again on what area of the business you were in, you were focused on something that others might have viewed as super important to the organizational strategy or not. You had capacity, so maybe you were doing some fun things that weren't adding as much value, whereas your peers in another area, understaffed, maybe they weren't a revenue generating area of the business, so they had a smaller team, super important work, and there's one of them just burning the midnight oil. So what we wanted to do was really have, a director doing director work and a specialist doing specialist work, and be focused on it as a whole for the organization. So we kept directors in the business embedded in at the leadership tables, understanding the strategies, providing great proactive strategic advice at the table, and then they would rely on the center to support. And then as the center got, 100 requests, which I like to joke that we have an infinite amount of requests and a finite number of resources, even if it's 21, which is a large number, we still get more than we can focus on. And so having an ability within that center to say, we're going to rank these, we call it P1, 2, 3, and 4, based on how aligned is it to the organizational structure, what's the impact, how big is the change people are going to feel, and let's really prioritize, is this a 1, 2, 3, or 4, and that helps us decide. A P1, yeah, a director should be leading this, developing the strategy. They might have support from the center on execution. Or is it a P4? And if we don't have capacity, it's going to drop below the waterline and go into a backlog until we do. So the benefit was that we could put resources to those most strategic P1 types of work versus if you had capacity, you worked on whatever came in. So it has really allowed us to get the right roles working on the right work and making sure we're focused on the right work as a communications team.
I think that is such a good insight that you and your team created that your own structure. So almost this, hey, we're going to take charge, because otherwise the work then starts to flow in and run the department instead of the department kind of running the work that's really driving business value. That is such a good tip. And then how did you communicate that out to, was that something new, and how was that received when you kind of created P1, 2, 3, 4?
Yeah, I would say that part outside of our team isn't as known. I would say the bigger change piece and what we had to communicate is, in some cases, someone had one communicator doing all of their stuff and another person had five. And what was trickier there was to say, like, hey, we're going to move those resources out of your team, but you're still going to get the same level of support. That was a harder sell. Like, we had to make sure they understood, just because they're not in your unit dedicated to your unit, they're still going to provide, you're still going to have a team of 21 behind you. And if it's the most strategic work, they're going to be working on it, right? Which of course means if it's not, we have to have a bit more of a conversation. But that's why it was really important to keep those directors and senior managers in the business to be able to manage those relationships and conversations as, things that we might have worked on before for them became less strategic, less important.
Got it. So tell me about this award. You recently won an award. Give me the scoop behind that.
Our team is a member of IABC, and we just got the corporate communications department of the year, which was an amazing accomplishment and something we've talked about wanting to work towards and apply. And so we've been applying for individual um, awards. Different team members apply every year, and this year, between internal and external, we had 3 awards of excellence, which was great. And yeah, we ended up getting the Department of the Year, which we were all super pumped about.
We look at your team. And again, if I'm an internal communicator, I am salivating at the fact, like, gosh, I want to work with Calvin and his team. And there's this perception of, and I've seen the stuff that you've done when you've presented at, ALI and different events, and it's so innovative and so compelling. And so if I'm sitting here again, as most of our listeners are, and my team is smaller and I'm kind of drowning in the day of the work, but I also want to be strategic and get there. So this whole season, we're kind of talking about closing the gap. Like, I'm here, but I want to get to where Calvin is. Is there some quick tips or ideas, or maybe thought changes, paradigm shifts that you could offer our listeners of where is the first place that I should start if I want to get to point A to point B to really move the needle and elevate my team and the value I provide? How do you do that? And where should I start?
Yeah, where do you start? Especially when you say you're at capacity and you don't have time to think, like, and then spend the time to invoke change. I think looking at what's eating up your time, what's not adding value, for sure for us, I'll repeat that kind of phrase around having finite resources and infinite requests, right? Um, and so we're engaged a lot because we are valued. So that even though we're 21, we still get more requests than we could execute on. So that ability to focus, what's going to add the most value, moving out of the tactics space. So when someone comes to me with like, and everyone listening to this, I'm sure will relate, we need a video, we need a podcast, we need an article, we need X, Y, Z, right? We really bring the conversation back up to what are you trying to achieve, right? Like, what are we trying to get out of this? And then sometimes, maybe it is a video or a podcast, rarely, but even if it is, what's the messaging behind that? And is it something, if you have a smaller team, like where can you help people be better communicators themselves? Where can you provide platforms for them to share that you don't need to do that and really focus on that higher value, higher impact communications work?
So, when you were trying to organize your department and when you were saying we were trying to create focus and align everything with what drove value, how did you discover what were the things that provided value? Was that something that you came up with, or did you meet with leadership and have that conversation? So, let's get I think deeper into the word value. How do I figure that out if I'm running my team? And how do I uncover that and unearth that and align that with leadership so that we're all aligned and agree on these are the things that provide value?
Yeah, I think it is like your approach to the communication, right? So I would say early in my career, I was really driven towards tactics and having innovative tactics and trying cool things. And as I've moved along in my career, I'm all about adding value. So it's not the things that I'm doing necessarily that, I mean, they are at the end. The things I'm doing are what's adding value, but it really is that front end of the conversation. So, what's the business need? What are they trying to achieve? What's the behavior change they need from someone? Like, how are they doing today? What's tomorrow? What's the audience? What are they going to be resistant to? Like, that is the value add as opposed to the output, I would say, and what you're producing. Like, if you haven't done that front end piece and really thought strategically about every communication and every request that's coming in, you could produce a lot, but you might not be adding value in the sense that you're going to help that organizational unit or the organization achieve its results. Um, and I remember when I started my career that, and I would hear that people saying that, and I'm like, oh, that sounds so boring. Like I want to do cool things, right? And you still can. You can. We do a lot of innovative type communications, but we have a saying at ATB a bit like finish the sentence. Like, what are you really trying to get to and achieve? And so when people come in with those requests, it's easy to just produce, but we really do kind of stop the conversation to be like, okay, what are we trying to achieve? Like, why a podcast? Because your audience is CSRs at the front line with no speakers, kind of thing, right? Like people have all sorts of requests, but we really want to add value in helping them achieve their business objectives.
Yeah. So when we think of, our brand with Internal Comms Pro, again, we're really trying to think of what makes someone move to that pro level. What in your, experience, when you think of your growth, over the 11 years that you've been, at ATB and now to be this award-winning department, what pushed you to the pro side, or what makes an internal communicator go pro?
Yeah, good question. I think, for sure that ability to think strategically, and I would say not just in communication. So, a lot of conversation around how do I get to the leadership table? How do you stay there? Like, our leaders be pretty frank. If I have someone at the leadership table, I want them to add value, right? And they would say, even as communicators, we don't want you just talking about communication. So business acumen is huge. How do you show up at the leadership table? How are you demonstrating value? Um, you know, you often get viewed as content creators in communication, right? Or that tactical execution piece, writing stories. But I think a big part of our job. Can you say shit on a podcast?
Absolutely. We'll just put explicit on your episode, Calvin.
Thanks. But I remember one leader I had once saying, yeah, part of our job is to say there's a big pile of shit in front of you. Don't step in it.
Mhm.
And at that point we haven't created anything, right? Like that, although you use the word shit, is pretty professional in the sense that you're adding strategic value at that table. I think listening is another big one. If you're not clear on what you're trying to accomplish, what they're trying to accomplish, you could just solve for the wrong problem. So I think that pro level, you have to be a really good listener. Speak up when you need to speak up, and yeah, really add that strategic value.
Did you catch all of that? It is what I love so much about this podcast, getting exact language to use to reposition us as strategic thinkers and leaders. I love Calvin's list of questions that help position his team to drive value. Now, don't worry if you missed those. We've got a cheat sheet for you on internalcommspro.com/show notes. Just click on this episode and you can access it for free. Now, in this next part, Calvin gives us insight on how they were prepared for COVID and how he empowers his team to overcome the request and produce default, which we are all way too familiar with. Okay, before we get back into the episode, I would be remiss here if I didn't make mention of a new product that addresses some of the pains we're going to be talking about this season. It's a new product from our longtime supporter, Circle. Jumping back and forth between platforms to fix a single misplaced comma is so frustrating. What if you could create, edit, and distribute all your internal content from one centralized platform? With Circle Broadcast, their new product, you can simplify and innovate your IC tech stack with their cross-channel comms approach. With one click, you can publish and send your content to your employee email, SharePoint, and mobile app. Now your employees can consume it on the channel of their choice. Head on over to circle.com/ICP to learn more about this unique internal comm solution. That's CERKL.com/ICP. One more real quick thing. Hey, thanks to our listeners who've taken the time to rate and review our podcast. These reviews help us iterate. It's part of the reason why we shortened this season's episode to be more bite-sized. Help our new listeners find us by leaving a rating and a review today. Okay, let's get back to Calvin. So when you were, have you always been in internal comms? What's your personal backstory? How did you arrive at being an internal, comms pro yourself?
Yeah, I pretty much have been, which is weird. And I took a communications degree, and then I did a master's in communications, like a master's of arts in communications. And then I've always been in internal communications, which is not the case necessarily with everyone who's on my team. And certainly my cohort from university, when I look back at people that went into communications as careers, I've always been on that internal side of communications, which I think is a wonderful place to be, honestly. Like the stuff you can do and try, and it's a bit safer within the walls of or the firewalls of your team on the kind of fun stuff you can fool around with. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, no, I've always been on that internal side.
So with this new normal that everybody's talking about, good old COVID-19, what kind of resources or maybe your team looking to invest in now? Tell me a little bit about your strategy and what your team's thinking about in regards of kind of heading into the back end of this year and into, next year.
We've been really lucky as an organization, and as the COVID stuff was happening, and I can't remember where I read this or listened to it, but it's resonated that you can't predict and plan for COVID, right? We couldn't predict and plan for COVID, but you can be prepared. And we were really prepared. We have obviously retail locations or essential service. People had to go into the branch and help customers face to face. But we've had a pretty diverse suite of tools to allow us to work remotely in a culture that kind of had the attitude of work from where you can do your best work. And so we had a technology. So we went to the G Suite, Google Suite, 3 years ago from Microsoft, and that helped us leaps and bounds just to be able to work from wherever. So leaving the office was easy for the bulk of us. Going back, obviously, a bit tricky as we try to stay safe. But yeah, we have now. Now it really is, how do we leverage these digital tools and really make them sing that we're forced to be remote on a larger scale.
Well, and I remember seeing that whole G Suite promotion, and you use the word shit again, even in that promotion. Get your shit in the cloud, if I recall, was the
That's right.
tagline, right?
Another
Yeah.
award-winning Maria, my team, actually did a gold quill for that too. That's huge. Like, I would put a shout out to IABC or other associations where they do those awards. I learned so much on my first application of those, just around strategic planning, right? Like, I had a graduate degree, I'd been doing the job for a bit. And when you really got into how they mark those awards, it is around, what's the business need? What are you trying to achieve? How are you going to measure it? Who's your audience? Like, how does that drive the strategy? It was huge. And so that's part of the reason we applied for those awards. It's a reason we got Department of the Year, is that is our approach to pretty much all communications we do. We don't just get a request and produce. We really do take that, depending on, again, how complex the project is how much time you might spend on the front end. But we're always asking those questions around, why are we doing it? What are we trying to achieve? How will we know? We're spending lots of time on how we can measure things, really on outcome objectives and seeing a shift in behavior and adoption of things. It doesn't have to be, a whole bunch of focus groups and thinking through. It could be literally one half an hour conversation with someone, but it really does drive to better results.
Yeah. Well, and let's talk about that, because I think people think that, internal communicators, it's just, hey, they are tactical, which is a total myth, that it really is a demands for, top level strategic thinking. Are there any other common myths about internal comms that you wish to debunk, while we got our listeners here? Any?
This is preaching to the choir, though, I think, probably. Make things pretty is another one, of course. Like, we're going to,
Mhm.
I would say, so the producing one, I think the other thing is that, communications can solve other underlying issues, right? So people aren't using something, or there's a behavior. Well, if we just, put out an article, or communications can solve it, even if we have a really great strategy. Sometimes it's not, communications can't solve bad strategy on the other side, or a bad product, but it's nice that they think we definitely have that ability. But sometimes it's a harder conversation to be like really digging into the why people aren't doing something, or why they are behaving a certain way. And is it just a lack of understanding, or is it a more foundational piece? But I think that's for sure one we see.
Mhm.
Tactical, we're very tactical, but then on the other extreme, our tactics can change bigger systemic problems.
Now, don't worry, we're not quite finished with Calvin. Next week, we continue our conversation with this award-winning Department of the Year and uncover their secret as to how they freed up more time to focus on the right work, as well as the key piece to Calvin's strategy cycle, and ultimately how they create an environment to be disruptors. And yes, of course, that episode will have another resource guide too that you can download at internalcommspro.com/show notes. Stay with us as our journey to closing the gap continues.
Internal Comms Pro podcast is produced by Super Awesome Media. Our theme music is Big Vision by Purple Planet Music. Don't forget to visit www.internalcommspro.com/show notes for our free resource guides. Thank you for listening.